Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm flying solo today because everybody seems to have abandoned me, but that's fine because I have a good friend of mine, so I'm not going to be totally alone. I've got with me today Dan Kazeta, who has been on this podcast before to tell us his wonderful story about his llama, and obviously his previous book, Toxic, which was about nerve agents and the history of them. But this time round, he's gone down a slightly different road. And he's come to talk to us about his new book, which is something that I've been begging to have on the podcast for so long. And finally, someone answered my prayer. And that's to do about the Baltic resistance against the Nazis and the Soviets. And the book is called The Forest Brotherhood. Welcome, Dan.
Well, thank you for having me. And you're not completely alone. You got me. You may not deserve me, but you got me.
Oh, aren't you a sweetheart? So, I've been trying to get someone to come and talk about the Baltics. We've had very little on the Baltics. It's been pissing me off. So finally we can do something that I've been trying to get onto this podcast for a while, even though we're talking about slightly more modern history. But that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. So out of curiosity, I mean, I know this answer, but I think our listeners deserve to know the answer. Why have you suddenly gone from nerve agents and something that you are a complete and utter specialist at to something that is not completely out of your comfort zone, but a couple of steps out of it?
I've gone back to my roots, in fact. You know the story, but for the benefit of the listeners, I'm actually half Lithuanian. My name really probably should be Danielius Kašetas.
Yes, which is what I started calling you at the beginning. You're like, no.
No, and it works for me every time I'm east of about Warsaw and east. I'm Kazeta. That's okay. Yes, I'm half Lithuanian, and I grew up with these stories, and they were just stories, and it was not really written about. And the Baltic states were written out of history, but they weren't written out of my history, so it was like this black spot. And I spent much of my life, really annoyed at that. I even wrote some papers on it. I even had a paper published as an article as an undergraduate in 1988 on this subject.
Did you say 1988?
1988. My first publication was in 1988 when I was 19 years old. I was an undergraduate at Texas Christian University. I got published in Lituanis, the Lithuanian American Journal of Studies,
Not to make you feel old, I was 2 in 1988.
It's all right. That's all right. I get mostly ignored, but, there's a family trait, I would say. Apologies to any Lithuanian listeners, but maybe this rings home. There's this problem I would call. I refer to it as Lithuanian junk man syndrome. I don't throw things away. My father never throws things away. My dad never throws anything away. My granddad never threw anything away. And in particular, I never threw away a single scrap of paper that had anything on it about Lithuanian history. So I've got this vast back catalog of stuff that eventually reach critical mass and, more importantly, an opportunity, because all of a sudden people are actually caring about this part of the world again. Not for what I would call the right reason, because there's a big war. I would just rather assume that people would be interested in the Baltic states because, well, they're interesting places, and we don't know much about it. But hey, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I've got my book, and my book is relevant for a lot of reasons that we can probably talk to later on. So that's how I came to write it. The immediate cause is my lovely publisher basically had a bit of a, all right, guys and gals, what have you got? Ukraine's being invaded. What do you got? So I pitched the book, and next thing you know, I had a contract. And more importantly, there's an awful lot of archival material that is now much more accessible than there was 20 or 30 years ago. There's a lot of stuff you can dig into. And, the Baltic states are not technical backwaters. I mean, Skype was invented in Estonia, for example. A whole lot of this stuff is digitized. There's huge amounts online now. And even though my grasp of Baltic languages isn't great, guess what? The translations tools are much better. So there you have it.
I've got to say, not many people do talk about, I'd say, Eastern and Central Europe up until really the Ukrainian war, and this kind of opened up discussions and literature and academia to
Yeah.
speaking about it less, because at the moment, if you do talk about Eastern Central Europe, it's Russia, Russia,
Oh
Russia,
yeah.
Russia, Russia, Russia.
Oh yeah. And I raised the question early on in this book. Why don't we call Finland a Baltic state? And even the Finns scratch their head at that.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Let's not get onto a Twitter spat. You're terribly notorious for that. Don't
Notorious.
drag
Notorious. All publicity is good, I discovered. But yes.
don't drag me into your Twitter spats, even though I sometimes drag you into mine and
Yeah.
you
Fair
drag me
enough.
into yours.
So where do you want to go with this story? Because there's a story to be told here, and it's one that people don't know.
I mean, first of all, tell us what the Baltic states are, because some people
Okay.
on this podcast may not actually know what we mean when we refer to the Baltic states. I know it's a really simple question,
Okay.
but
All right. You got this thing called the Baltic Sea, which sits sort of, on if you look at the sort of northeastern Europe on the map, you get this big body of water, the Baltic Sea. And on the left side of it, you got Sweden. And on the bottom of it, you got Poland and Germany. On the sort of top right bit of it, you got Finland. But then you got these three countries that are between Poland and Finland. All right. So working south from Finland, you got Estonia, then Latvia, and then Lithuania. These three countries, not terribly big, but not tiny, tiny, tiny either, all have quite a distinct culture, a distinct history. There's a lot of things in common between them, but there's also a lot of differences. Each one sort of looks to a somewhat different heritage in the past. And so that's what we're talking about. I'm going to go and sort of start at the bottom again with Lithuania. Lithuania was a large place in the Middle Ages. It was a grand duchy that was much bigger than current present day Lithuania. So it harkens back to this ancient history, last pagan nation in Europe, converted only in the 1300s, and it has largely been a Western-facing grand duchy once it had that conversion to Christianity. With strong relationships with Poland, it became conjoined with Poland through a dynastic merger. So for many, many, many years, the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation or Commonwealth was effectively like Austria-Hungary. It was a big country, but had sort of two different crowns. And the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland were technically separate, but the same person held both offices. And it faced Eastern enemies. It faced Tatars. It faced Russians. It faced some Western enemies early on, Teutonic Knights, who were, well, tired of trying to convert these pagans and decided, well, we're going to keep converting them even though they've been converted. So there was a war against the Teutonic Knights. And so Lithuania has this history, and that history gradually fades as time goes on, and the Polish and Lithuanian Confederation, as you will, gradually gets salami sliced out of existence. And the last partition of Poland is in 1795. Lithuania disappears off the map. It's just an outpost of Tsarist Russia then.
well,
Now,
that's it. How many countries disappeared just because of Russia?
oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And so yes, Lithuania has disappeared because of Russia before. So every Lithuanian gets the Ukrainian existential angst. The next two countries north, Latvia. The Latvians speak a Indo-European language that is similar to Lithuanian. However, quite early on, they were conquered by crusading German knights. These Teutonic knights, the Livonian order conquered them, converted them to Catholicism, and basically this place was for lack of a better term, a colonial holding of Germanic knights. Same thing with the Estonians. The difference with the Estonians being that they are fundamentally, ethnically, and linguistically different people. They're cousins to the Finns. Estonian is a complex, Finno-Ugric language with lots of noun declensions and no prepositions. It's really hard to get your head around. But both of those countries had at various points domination by Swedes and Germans. So the Protestant Reformation came through, and then they became Lutheran. So while the Lithuanians were Roman Catholic like their Polish neighbors. So again, they got salami sliced off the map a little bit earlier than 1795, and got taken as a result of basically wars that Russia was having with the Swedes. And there you get it. There you get it. The situation: small countries caught between bigger countries. In this case, Sweden was the big country. Swedes don't like to admit that they had a colonial empire. They did. It was, in some kind of senses, you could call it Finland. In other senses, at various times, it was bits of Estonia and Latvia.
And Poland.
And Poland. Well, yes, the whole. Yeah. Well, yeah. Exactly. The problem with an elected monarch is sometimes you got to live with the guy that you elect. Yeah. So these countries all disappeared off the map and got subsumed into Tsarist Russia. Well, Tsarist Russia collapsed, as we all know, in 1917, and everywhere from Finland all the way down to Moldova, and to a lesser extent the Caucasus as well. There was a free-for-all of captive nations trying to regain their independence, achieve their national status. Some places were more successful than others. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia all got back onto the map. Ukraine back on the map only for a very short period of time. Belarus for a few weeks. The Georgians for a little while. But also the same thing's going on in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Czechoslovakia comes out of that, this strange thing that came to be called Yugoslavia. So anyway, new nations are back on the map. And so
let's stick with this. You're already on the topic, right? So First World War happens. New nations are now formed. You've got new Poland, new Lithuania, Latvia, like you said, briefly Ukraine, briefly Belarus. What is happening post-war? Because the history here goes hand in hand to pretty much what I've been talking. So anybody who's been listening to my pole positions will know about interwar Poland and how much I talk about it. Because they're literally similar but very different at the same time.
Yes, all three of them get very democratic constitutions. You could say almost that particularly Latvia and Estonia suffered from a surplus of democracy, in that the threshold to set up a political party was very low. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of political parties. It was they had numerous parliaments and numerous coalitions. Latvian governments lasted something like 9 months on average, similar in Estonia. Lithuania, a little more stable. Lithuania suffered badly from, dare I say it, this frozen conflict with Poland. There was a big, Poland and Lithuania had we could probably do a whole episode on this one.
Oh my God, let's do it.
Oh yeah, we'll do that. We'll save that. But there was a brief war followed by 17, 18 years of anxiety, and the city that Lithuania looked at as its ancient capital, Vilnius, Vilno, whatever you want to call it, we can call it either, is no longer in Lithuanian hands. The Lithuanians have to set up a provisional capital in Kaunas, and so there's bad relations between Lithuania and its southern neighbors. So Lithuania sees itself at first sandwiched between two neighbors it doesn't like, and then two neighbors it doesn't like are the Poles and the Soviets. But in all three cases, you get a gradual slide into authoritarianism. And now it's a common sort of Soviet propaganda trope to say that these interwar republics were just fascists. They weren't. The word fascism gets thrown around, but we're not.
I'm not in here because the West, but people from the West, America, and everything else, and I really need to underline this. They don't seem to understand, right? That at this time period in the interwar period, not only are these countries it's a birth of a brand new country.
Oh
right?
yeah.
So
yeah.
Your borders are going to be changing, and Brits and even the French, even the Spanish and the Americans don't understand what it is with a border change. And every single couple of months, every year, the borders are constantly shifting. So the borders that you see in 1918 are not the same as 1920, that are not the same as 1939 1939 when the Soviets invade Poland, right?
Oh
And
yeah. And so what's going on in the Baltic states? A lot of things. There is nation building. All of it, these countries have to build their entire infrastructure as nations from scratch. So they build school systems, and they figure out how to spell in Lithuanian. Lithuanian did not have standardized spelling.
Oh, hold on. Question to
Yeah.
that. Sorry, just an off topic because considering I'm just going to be throwing random stuff at you all this time. Lithuanian is, how do I even phrase this question? The Lithuanian language has always been there. Did they
Yes.
have to reinvent literally everything from the language at this stage, from like the bottom?
No, the language existed, but it had a lot of different dialects, a lot of different spelling conventions, and and there were a lot of, dare I say it, Germanisms in the spelling, or Polishisms, depending where you were, because there's this funny little place, we call it Klaipeda, but for many, it was called Memel. Uh, and it was part of Germany it's the easternmost outpost of East Prussia. But for that entire period of 1795 onward till independence, it was really where the publishing industry was in Lithuanian language because it was under German control, and the Germans had freedom of the press. So there was this whole thing about you know books being printed in Lithuanian smuggled in because the Tsar was literally trying to get rid of the Lithuanian language. So you got an existing Lithuanian literature from, say, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, with a lot of German spelling conventions in it. And the German's not so popular by 1918. Also, there's a war with Poland. So, I have a Polish spelling of my surname. And that,
Oh no, how dare you?
So yeah, and also that for a small country, there's still quite a distinct regional dialect. So they standardized the language, and standardized the spelling, and adopted basically Czech spelling conventions with lots of hot checks, instead of the various Polish or German conventions that were going on, so they standardized the orthography using largely sort of a Czech sort of idea. And the Czechs had just done the same thing. The Czechs had gone through their own national renaissance and all that, and had gone and sort of de-Germanized their whole language, and that was considered really politically neutral. Nobody had any grievance with that. So there you have it. So these countries have to establish textbooks and a publishing industry, and everything. When the huge thing is land reform, because much of the land was tied up in these big landed estates, particularly in Estonia and Latvia, still belonging to these old German, families. And so, breaking up the estates and giving land to the to smallholder farmers is a big thing. That's in fact more politically significant than boundary shifts. Yeah. So a lot of stuff is going on here, but then we get the Great Depression. All right. There was a worldwide depression, and these are not wealthy countries, and these are countries still largely basing their economy on agriculture. And the economies tanked like they tanked everywhere. And so you get this, you get one or another variety of strongmen basically taking over the government in all three. And interestingly enough, these strongmen don't come out of a fascist nationalist sort of ideology. In fact, in all three countries, there were small fascist movements that these particular strongmen. Konstantin Pats was the strongman in Estonia. Omanis was this guy in Latvia, and Antanas Smetona was the guy in Lithuania. They all viewed these crackpot right-wing groups as far more of a threat than actually communists. They had more or less run all the communists out during their successful escape from during the Russian Civil War. So the communist parties were very, very small in these things. These regimes viewed the ideological far right as an existential threat. And actually, Lithuania goes down as the one country to actually lock up Nazis in the pre-war era, because Nazis were agitating in Klaipeda because the Nazis wanted Memel back, and eventually the Nazis did take Memel back. But so
listen, hold on before we go on further, because we've got so much to talk about. I think we should really come back and revisit some of
Yeah,
these
we
topics.
could do a whole interwar era in Poland at some point. Let's get on to the good stuff.
I was about to say, let's get
Yeah.
on to the good stuff. So,
All right.
let's
So
talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
yeah, this is where it all starts to go bad because Hitler and Stalin signed this devil's alliance, to take a term from our friend Roger Morehouse, and they divide this whole bit of Europe between them, from Finland all the way down to the Black Sea. They come up with this dividing line, and it's one that takes a number of countries completely out of existence. It takes Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland totally out of existence. And
so, for example, there's a secret protocol for
yes,
Poland.
the secret protocol literally draws this dividing line. And this is at a point where you got to remember, for context for our readers, this secret protocol was drawn up 9 days before the Nazis ride into Poland, and of course 17 days later the Soviets ride into eastern Poland. Now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania don't know of the existence of the secret protocol, and they're really, really, really hoping that they can be like Sweden, for example, or at the time Denmark or Netherlands, all these countries that had ridden out as neutral in the First World War. Like, okay, well, this is all bad. Not only that, it's briefly actually very good for the Lithuanians, because the Soviets give the Vilnius region to back to Lithuania, and so Lithuania has got its old capital again. And this is something Lithuanians don't like me putting. I'm going to get hate mail for this one. It's because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Vilnius is now the national capital of Lithuania, and not a quaint provincial backwater in northeastern Poland. Yeah, so there you go.
How dare you say facts?
Yeah, I know. So you got almost immediately after this, Stalin starts his war with Finland, and that scares the crap out of the Estonians and the Latvians and the Lithuanians, because they don't have the size of military or the strategic depth to fight off the Russians like the Finns were doing. And it wasn't a done deal that the Finns were going to win that to a stalemate. It could have gone either way. Not only that, lots of Estonians went and volunteered. Okay, so moving forward a little bit, in June of 1940, what's going on in June of 1940? Hitler is literally parading down the Champs-Élysées in France, having taken over much of Western Europe. The Dunkirk invasion is all that. Britain stands alone, all this stuff,
Auschwitz is opened. Sorry, had to throw that one in. June 1940.
Yeah. And so while the attention of the rest of the world is diverted through a relatively rapid but complicated chain of events, the Soviets lean on the Baltic states and lean on them hard enough that they basically crumble and get occupied. It's not really fair to call it an armed invasion, although there are one or two situations where some units of the military did actually resist. It was this, they just got rolled, and the president of Lithuania did flee, ended up in, of all places, Cleveland, Ohio.
Random much?
Well, he should. Anyway, there's a whole story about him, and anyway, so he fled. The Latvian and Estonian leadership ended up in the Gulag, but basically rigged elections were staged. These elections were staged very, very quickly, with an amazingly 120% voter turnout in some districts, and the usual.
120. Hold on, should we put this in quotation marks?
Yeah.
120% voter turnout. Wow.
Yeah,
Hold on.
yeah.
They did the same thing in Poland.
Yeah, there was usually only one candidate for every district. In a few cases, Estonia's managed to actually get other candidates on the ballot. It really confused things.
Oh God.
But so these national people's governments were formed, and basically the only thing these people's governments did was meet and vote to be annexed into the Soviet Union. So all of a sudden, these countries disappear again. It becomes the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Latvian SSR, and the Estonian SSR. And so and it happens very quickly. If you have been bonked on the head and were unconscious in a hospital bed in Kaunas on the I don't know the 31st of May 1940, and you woke up a month later, you woke up in a totally different world.
So what was it like? What was the occupation of the Baltic states like for them?
It was really bad. It was horrible. It was as bad as you can think. First of all, lots of people just started disappearing. Okay.
Can you hear the word gulag, gulag?
Yeah. Well, lots of people disappeared. And so at first it was like newspaper editors and large owners of businesses and politicians.
Shock, horror, horror. They're targeting the intelligentsia.
Yeah. Officers of rank of about major and above. There's a whole process by which the three militaries, which were not that large, were being integrated into the Red Army. So lots of Soviet officers got brought in. Junior officers and enlisted men were kept in the army, but the senior leadership, all disappears. Some old ones are actually left out to retire. The press, religion, the economy is all basically rapidly Sovietized. Okay, there isn't a rapid collectivization of agriculture in the rural areas because that actually takes time. Okay, there's talk of that, and there's talk of busting up some of the larger land holdings and things like that, and a lot of things are in process, but everybody can kind of see where the trajectory is going. Okay, and then comes the first big wave of deportations. Okay, and the timing of this is particularly important. This huge wave of mass deportations with, many tens of thousands of people locked up, put on railway cars, usually cattle cars, and taken east, not just to Siberia, but places like Kazakhstan and north bits of Russia that technically aren't Siberia. We all say Siberia, but technically it's not correct. There was a lot of other bad places in the Gulag that weren't just Siberia, and so that happens in June of 1941. Now, obviously, there are people that don't like this. Okay, and so there is early organizing of resistance. And so the early resistance stuff is not what you would call the sort of big armed partisan movements. It's some of it is really amateurish. It's student groups meeting and writing manifestos, and guess what? They all get locked up. Okay, there's a lot of stuff like that. There is some underground press going on. There is also, a lot of people trying to flee. There are a lot of people, particularly from Latvia and Estonia. So some people really do try to flee while the borders are open. Latvia and Estonia have far more coastline, giving them access out on the Baltic Sea. The Lithuanians' coastline is not very big, so it's harder to get out by sea. And now we get these fragmented sort of resistance movements starting to work themselves out, starting to do things like hide guns and things like that. Because all three of the countries had basically reserve components of the military. There was this thing called the Kazeta in Estonia. There was in Latvia there was the National Guard. And Lithuania there was this thing called the Riflemen's Union. These were all state-sponsored paramilitary movements that were quite dispersed. And the Soviets didn't easily get a handle on these things because they were well dispersed. So a lot of rifles and stuff got squirreled away. All right. And so what happens in this exact week that these deportations are happening? It's late June of 1941. The Germans turn up. Okay. All right. At the exact point at which everybody's outraged and basically fearing for their lives and wondering if they or their friends or their neighbors or their brothers or sisters are going to get stuck on a railway car off to some unpleasant place. Now, an interesting fact is one of these groups that was formed as a resistance cell was formed in, of all places, Berlin. And this is slightly...
What?
Yeah, the Lithuanian Activist Front was being run in Berlin. And the Nazis clearly tolerated it because I think they understood. I mean, the Nazis pretty well figured out that these guys are going to be useful, causing hell in the enemy rear. Um, and there was this guy Kazeta who had been the defense attaché for a long time at the Lithuanian embassy in in Berlin. Pre-Nazi era, he had very good contacts in the Weimar era. He had a lot of military contacts, and importantly, he had contacts with the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. And that's an interesting thing to say. Oh, Schirpa was a Nazi agent, and then you start looking at the history of the Abwehr. The Abwehr is actively plotting against Hitler during much of this. So it's. I'm not saying it's nuanced. I'm just saying it's complicated and messy. Okay. The Germans, particularly German military intelligence, was conducting liaison with these embryonic national resistance movements in all three countries. That's not to say that these things were German fronts; they really weren't. The Lithuanian group was very much still run out of Kaunas and had this overseas wing that was partly in Berlin and partly in Bern, Switzerland. And there was lots of arguments because it was a broad front. It was trying to represent every single Lithuanian political party, and they all hated each other.
Well, that's smart, isn't it? Really?
Oh yeah, it's these government exiles. They get.
I mean, that's why the Home Army in the end kind of like formed into one, because having all of these factions just becomes impossible to be able to monitor everybody.
So what you get is immediately, however, something was clearly cooked up and ready to go, because before the sunset on the first day of the invasion, the Lithuanians are already revolting. No, my mother's father would say, "Well, you Lithuanians, you've been revolting for a long time," but there was a big uprising in Lithuania, primarily in Kaunas, which had been the provisional capital, but elsewhere too. And this uprising clearly caught the Soviets by surprise, just as much as the German invasion did. And this uprising, there were uprisings further north in Latvia and Estonia. They took a little bit longer to crystallize, but also it took the German military more time for them to get there. And so the Lithuanian uprising basically declares its own, redeclares the republic, declares a provisional government, which only lasts for a few days because the Germans say, having a Lithuanian government really isn't in our plan here, guys, and end up locking some of them up or telling them to go home, or in some cases basically drafting some of the partisan units as police battalions, which becomes problematic later on because they get drafted then into the SS. And there are some really bad incidents of pogroms because almost immediately these SS guys and Gestapo guys start turning up, and they start issuing out really awful anti-Semitic propaganda to these provisional units, and one or two of them start to take it seriously. A lot of them don't, but there are some massacres of Jews that happened in the 1941 uprisings, and it's pretty grim stuff. But basically, the stereotype is that these Baltic peoples greeted the Germans as liberators. Some did. What I think was an awful lot of people were optimistic that a German invasion was going to be like 1914, 1915, because you know what? When the Kaiser's army turned up in that part of the world, it was actually a very good thing for the Baltic states, because all of a sudden it wasn't illegal to publish in Lithuanian anymore. The Kaiser era World War I occupation of the Baltic states basically let people get on for things and basically let local government happen, and for the first time in hundreds of years. And so
I can see the perspective there, because if you're being oppressed by one and another comes in and goes, right, okay, here you go, here is your freedom, here is for you to behave the way you want to do, but hey, we're still going to draft some of your people and whatever. Even though I don't agree with it, I'm just going to underline this before somebody takes my words out of context. Even though I do not agree with this.
And the German occupation was bad. but the German occupation wasn't taking the average peasant or average urban worker and at least not right away shoving them in railway cars. Okay, but the German occupation was extremely bad for the people that the Nazis wanted to exterminate, which was the Jews and the Romani people.
Yes.
Everybody talks about the Jewish Holocaust. A lot of people forget to talk about the Romani.
Yep.
And so they were even more effectively eradicated in the Baltic states than Jewish people.
Well, this is why, if you look at the statistics in Auschwitz,
Mm-hmm.
the only people that tended to arrive that are from the Baltic states
Mm-hmm.
are resistance fighters. They're the only ones.
Yeah.
You have no Jews coming or Roma or Sinti coming from those areas at all because they've been eradicated there.
Well, yeah, and much of the eradication of the Jews during this Nazi occupation was Einsatzgruppen. These people were shot. They didn't make it to the camps. There's and it happened quite early on in the occupation, 1941, 1942. So somebody who collaborated with the Nazis in 1943 started collaborating in 1943. It's hard to pin them to killing any Jews because the Jews were mostly dead by then. Okay, it's a rough time, and so the Germans set up this thing called Ostland. That was their province. They're sort of the Baltic and Belarus. It was 3 Baltic states and Belarus. Their equivalent of the general government, really. They did have local puppet administrations, which basically did local government, and that's when they started hoovering up the handfuls of local sort of fascist and fascist adjacent people, plus the usual opportunists. I should say that the collaboration works both ways in that rather a lot of Baltic peoples fought in the Red Army. Okay, so if you're gonna say, well, the Baltic states were Nazi collaborators, well, they were also Soviet collaborators, and so and also so much of this so-called collaboration was either heavily influenced by propaganda or just out and out conscripted, or people had a choice. It's all right, forced labor in Germany or join this self-defense battalion that we're going to throw in front of the Red Army. So there's a lot of that going on. And so it's a messy time.
It's not black and white, and people seem to think when talking about these subjects in the Second World War, it's simple. You had, people had a choice. Sometimes people didn't have a choice, and not that I'm saying this is all example. Obviously, I use Poland because that's my field, but sometimes people were given that choice of we either send you to a concentration camp, or we massacre your family, or you collaborate for the Gestapo. Now, not that I say that I condone whatever decision they made.
Yeah.
But put yourself in that position. That's what I'm telling our listeners. Put yourself in that position.
Yeah, and so there's it's a messy time where people had no good decisions and only a buffet of bad decisions, and it was hard to tell on the face of it which of these bad decisions was worse. And this heavily affected the partisan resistance. Partisan resistance is going on. It is largely because the first wave, these 1941 uprisings, get pretty well squashed. Okay, and some of these units get co-opted into German service, where also should say desertion is rife on all sides of this. So just because somebody served in one unit doesn't mean that necessarily they are a war criminal or not, because they may have deserted shortly after. So there's a lot of desertion going on. There are people who fought on every side of this battle. I mean, literally, there are situations where the same person fought in basically every army here. Okay, and so what you get, but also you get these resistance movements, and I do have to speed this up because we are using a lot of time here.
No, do you know what? I think our listeners would quite appreciate to stop at the Soviet invasion again.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2.
And we'll do a part 2 because this is quite interesting and I think it's important.
So what you get is you get fragmented resistance movements, much of what they're trying to do is to try to get in touch with their people in the West, because these countries had embassies and emigre groups elsewhere, particularly in Sweden. So there's fragments of, if not formal governments in exile, informal ones. And so there's a lot of, well, what do we do? Also, in 1941, 1942, you could be easily convinced by Nazi propaganda that Nazis were going to win, and this thing was going to be over soon. But by 1943, it was pretty obvious it could go either way. By the end of 1943, Baltic peoples are pretty like, these Nazis aren't going to last very long, and the Soviets are going to come back. So there's an awful lot of, we've got to be in this for a long haul. We got to wait, because these Soviets are going to come back, and they're not going to. They didn't like us before. They're going to pick up where they left off. So there is a lot of what I would call fake collaboration, in that in all three countries, a lot of these territorial defense units were set up at 1944, which were set up by the German army largely, to basically be cannon fodder and stay behind. But Baltic peoples were like, you know what? They're actually going to feed us and give us warm clothes and give us weapons. And so there was a lot of opportunistic enlistment to basically get a week's worth of rations and 3 hand grenades and a rifle and disappear again. There are instances in Latvia of the same guy under 12 different names, enlisting 12 different times and running off with 12 rifles. So there was that going on. I'd also say, in the context of the Holocaust, which is going on, there was also Jewish partisan groups, particularly in Kaunas and Vilnius. So we must not forget the Jewish partisan units. There's some excellent books on that. The Jewish partisan resistance doesn't figure as much further north. I should also say, I'm not trying to belittle the Holocaust in Estonia, but the pre-war Jewish community in Estonia was only something like 1,000 people,
Wow.
and it was almost entirely eradicated. So, yeah, but we also have heroic efforts to save Jewish people. There are 924 Lithuanians named in the Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem, and there's 138 Latvians. Only 3 Estonians, but one of them is you got to read that book. Quite a tale, that guy. And so,
can I just throw something else in here? Talking
yeah,
about the Righteous Among Nations,
yeah,
during the invasion. Wait, let me get this right. Hold on, I'm going to stick this in my head. When the Germans invaded Poland and then the Soviets invaded, a lot of Jews fled from the German section into the Soviet-occupied section,
yes,
and they managed to get out through Lithuania
yes,
before the Soviets came in. So a
yes,
lot, I think, were also involved in that, with helping and being able
yes.
to falsify passports to
Oh,
helping
yes.
people escape when they
And
had the chance.
interesting enough, there was a Japanese diplomat, Sugihara. He was basically the one Japanese diplomat in Kaunas. He issued visas to several thousand people, and this is a point where the Soviet Union is not has the Soviet Union hasn't rolled in. So we're talking about late 1939, early 1940, and so lots of these Jews actually transit across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway and to Vladivostok and get on boats to Shanghai. So with these Japanese
Incredible.
transit visas, yeah. But also there was this other guy. It's mentioned in Morehouse's book, the Dutch consul there, the honorary Dutch consul, was issuing these permits for people to go to Curacao in the West Indies. So yeah. Also, I mean, there were honest to God, efforts to smuggle Latvian Jews out to Sweden, because on Latvia's not inconsiderable coastline. There was that going on as well too. There was an order of Polish nuns in Vilnius that was quite active in smuggling weapons into the Vilnius ghetto, and there was I wouldn't call it. It wasn't an uprising to the same extent as the Warsaw Ghetto, but there was a bit of a uprising there, and basically a big breakout attempt, and some of these Jewish partisans managed to escape and end up effectively pairing up with Soviet partisans, because that's the other story here. There's this Soviet partisan movement, and Soviet historiography likes to try to claim a sort of copyright on this phrase partisan. They refer
Yeah.
to the fourth others as like bandits and criminals and all that. They try to put a little trademark after partisan. The Soviet partisan movement wasn't that big in the three Baltic states. But it wasn't non-existent either. And as you probably know, and your listeners probably know, that the genesis of it was Soviet army units who were basically left behind trapped behind enemy lines as the Germans as the Germans advanced. And so there were these pockets of and bands of Soviet soldiers stuck in the woods and swamps and stuff like that. And some of them coalesced into resistance groups, and eventually the Soviet state decided, well, we're going to support this, and we're going to airdrop supplies, and we're going to smuggle more people out to them and all that. And there were some of these units active. Okay. Honestly, some of these units really didn't get very well treated by their own side after the war because, the Soviet state didn't like people that were very good at guerrilla warfare in their own country. But yeah, so it's we have to fairly state that this was going on too, and so you get this whole situation now where all of a sudden the war is not going the way the Germans want. So the Germans are starting to leave. Now, one of the things the Germans are doing is they are stripping all of their culture and history out of out of Latvia and Estonia because there had been a large Baltic German minority, okay, in Latvia and Estonia, a little bit in Klaipėda, also known as Memel. The Germans basically, to a man and a woman, bugger off west. They're not going to stay around for yet another change in management. And you get this interesting period of time, particularly in Estonia, a little bit in Latvia. There becomes this hiatus where the Germans have effectively fled, but the Soviets haven't quite turned up yet. So you get this interregnum in about a 6-week window, a period of time where in parts of Latvia and much of Estonia, lots of people have a golden opportunity to flee. And so there's this huge exodus, because it's actually not from the north shore of Estonia to Finland. It's not very far, okay, and it's not from the western bit of Latvia. It's not that far, to Sweden. So you get this refugee movement also, and also you get the guys who are the worst collaborators. They know that they're facing the firing squad or the hangman's noose. The worst collaborators, they bugger off west with their German allies. Okay, and so leaving underground resistance movements who have been basically biding their time, and also these territorial defense units who have been set up as as effectively a last line of defense to await this Soviet advance. The Soviet advance comes in fits and starts, and as we get to the end of the war, what you get at the end of the war, you get to May 1945. In May 1945, all of Estonia had been so-called liberated, pretty much all of Lithuania, but only about half of Latvia. The western bit of Latvia was the so-called Kauerland Pocket, which had been this army group of the German army that had basically been cut off and not allowed to retreat. And so there was this large pocket of German troops, of which some were actually Latvian units in western Latvia, and so some of that became the basis of the resistance movement in Latvia. And so I think we're going to probably break this soon, and we're going to go to the next stage of this in the second podcast, part 2. So as the war comes to an end, you've got various groups, ranging in size from literally individuals who are basically just hiding out in somebody's barn, up to sort of what company size units, 100, 120 people, hiding out in forests and swamps. Okay, and I should say that you get this environment that is actually quite useful for partisan resistance, because you've got a lot of small farms. And small farms had not been collectivized and taken over by the Soviet state. The few that had been uncollectivized by the Nazis, because the Nazis wanted agricultural production. They were using this place as a breadbasket, and it's heavily forested. Particularly Lithuania, but there's lots of dense forest that you can hide in. So and lots of smaller farms that can support some level of a rural population that is hiding out. So you got this really soup of conditions that leads to really actually an interesting resistance movement, which becomes known in all three of them by this more or less the same nickname, the Forest Brothers, and that's and that's where we're going to get to in the next podcast here.
Exactly, I was going to say, because I think I could just leave you sitting here. I could just walk off and do some washing or something. And you could just run the whole podcast on your own.
I could guess on for a long time about this, but I think this is interesting stuff here, and yes. I think your listeners are going to like some of this stuff, and so I think we're going to draw this to a close. And it's early 1945, and it's in the Baltic states, and the Russians are coming.
Perfect. So just before we finish, because we are going to have a part 2, because we need to have a part 2. Remind our listeners the name of your book.
My book is called The Forest Brotherhood. And the Forest Brotherhood, Baltic Resistance Against the Nazis and Soviets.
Perfect.
It's published by C. Hurst and Company. It's available from all of your major online retailers. Here in the UK, you can order it direct from the publisher, or Foyles or Waterstones. Pretty much the whole world will sell it to you on Amazon.
We will get it in our bookshop, because then you get a bigger cut, we get a bit of that pie, and that big shop that we're not supposed to talk about, who may sue us, don't get the biggest cut. So you want to support your local bookshops. That's the most important thing.
Yes, indeed. And anybody who really wants to buy an autographed copy direct, I'm willing to make direct deals. You can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on the new Blue Sky, which is it's like the business class upgrade from Twitter.
Oh, interesting. I might have to join myself. Dan, listen, it's been great, and we will definitely get you back on to do part 2.
Okay.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.